Diaries of an Unfinished Revolution is a fucking brilliant, moving, tempestuously powerful compilation, a lot of three-syllable words, of 8 first-person accounts from the front lines of the Arab Spring: Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Yemen, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. Something that struck me immediately as I began reading this book was the amount of parallel, the mirrored scenes between what I've seen as an activist in this country and what these activists describe in the years and months leading up to their respective mass uprisings. January 25th marked the 5-year anniversary of the Egyptian Revolution, and as the press made a vague hearkening back to Tahrir Square, it felt appropriate, as we like to do on this show, to dig a little deeper than a commemorative headline. In the book, Yasmin El-Rashidi, a Cairo native, describes her home before the revolution. She describes a city waiting for change, but not yet at the tipping point, not yet placing their purpose in the political upheaval of a generation, finding themselves instead in a suspended state of apathy and quiet despair. Over the years, as I traveled back and forth, it seemed as if the population I had known had taken to the streets out of sheer listlessness, a peaceful expression of lack of, bidun. There was an increasing lack of jobs, of opportunities, of possibilities for a better life, an absence of hope. The government was promising reforms, privatizing, implementing wide-scale programs intended to boost the economy and improve quality of life. The indicators suggested that indeed the future was bright. But the reality, away from the numbers, was objection. Abject poverty, abject despair, despair so deeply ingested in the psyche of Egyptians it had turned, over the years, into an apathy palpable even in the city's air. In many ways, this was a population inert, sinking deeper and deeper, and I found myself floating, listlessly, restlessly, aimlessly, burdened by my own self as well as the story of the city. Yasmin wrote this about a year before what we consider to be the Egyptian Revolution began. Apathy, it seems, this subdued discontent, a complaining cabbie, a disgruntled family member, these are like the psychological warning signs for a populace on the verge of a break. Breakthrough, breakdown, maybe both at the same time. And Yasmin writes, the closer it got to the breaking point, the more shifts you started to see, small at first, another few people at a protest, another step too far by a police officer. And once Tahrir Square filled, it didn't herald the end of an uprising, the pinnacle. It was just another point on that descending timeline. In other words, what happened in Egypt didn't just happen, it's still happening. It is those marks in the sand, still being made. Yasmin makes it a point to write that there wasn't just one moment, there wasn't just one day or one person or decision that pulled thousands into the square, that turned the non-political into revolutionaries. It was years of that quiet discontent, years of apathy that couldn't sustain itself on a diet of meaning and future. It was the small actions, the small rallies, the inability to ignore just how bad shit was, no matter how many ads and propaganda that the government threw at people. And as you'll hear in a moment, what is still happening too is a continuation of these issues, the problems, the discontent, the hope and hopelessness, and the deep-seated corruption. These movements aren't a moment, to borrow a line from Black Lives Matter. These movements are ongoing, in Egypt and here in the US. So, how will our own quiet discontent, our own apathy play out? How will those small actions, events, and movements decide a breaking point, a breakthrough, a breakdown? Will we have a Tahrir Square? Will our military take over the way they have in Egypt? Can we look at Egypt's trajectory and learn something? Write our own course, consider things that we might not have thought of or thought to consider. In short, yes, we can. And Salma Hussein insists that we must. Salma Hussein, which is not her real name, by the way, is an Egyptian activist currently in the United States for a short speaking tour. She spoke with us late last week about the Egypt we don't know, past and present. She asked us to blur her face because, as she says, things in Egypt aren't good. She could be thrown in jail for dissenting, for writing on her blog, Quest for Justice, about her experiences, her hopes, sharing her free-thinking mind and her list of issues with the status quo in Egypt. Not least of all, the continued U.S. military backing. For us, it might be hard to imagine a situation where we would need to blur our own faces or adopt a fake name in order to tell foreign press the realities of living in this country. But it is in fact a reality that some political prisoners have already faced in this country. And it is one of many things that we must consider when looking at the parallels between two countries both filled with a populace stretched by inequality, injustice, and corruption. Take a look. I want to talk to you about the Egyptian military, because as an activist in the U.S., something that we think about a lot is if we were to have something like the Egyptian revolution happen here, our military being as large as it is, having them come in is a fear that a lot of activists have. Can you talk a bit about what the role of the Egyptian military has been in the revolution back in 2011, but also now?
Egypt has been a military dictatorship, basically. The military controls close to 50% of the economy in the country, so it's not just military, it's a military-industrial complex. And then with the 1950s coup, the officers and the military maintained powers within all of the civilian institutions. So when the revolution happened, it was a threat for all of these interests, political and economical and everything else. So the military had to maintain its interest and power. There was a discourse at the beginning that I've seen in all of the international media that the Egyptian military supported the revolution or whatever. And for some time, that's what a large number of people, even within the movement, believed, until the military started to show a different attitude towards the movement, with cracking down on journalists and activists and anybody who's trying to expose these violations. That started from the very beginning. And then with towards 2013, a year after the first president was elected, the military overthrew the president and took over completely. Right now, after a military general won the presidential elections in 2014, it seems like the military is the only player in the political scene in Egypt. So any voices of dissent, any other discourse or narrative or analysis other than what the military has to say or believes or wants people to believe is not allowed in the public arena. You have to be very careful about who you're talking to, what you're saying, what you're writing. People are getting attacked and arrested for writing things online. The protests are more outside of the major cities, like not in Cairo or Giza or any of the big cities, mostly in the Delta and Upper Egypt in the south, somewhere in the countryside. And yeah, I think things are very, very different in comparison to how they looked like a few years ago. Just in the past few months, like the number of people I personally know who got arrested or stopped at the airport or picked up from their homes or universities has increased dramatically. And
as you wrote on your blog, you wrote about a female activist who was found dead in her apartment. And you say that this is a part of the problem. It's not just that you have a revolution and you're done. There's a lot of depression and hopelessness that comes after, particularly because of what's happened there. And it seems particularly oppressive for women. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It was very disheartening for me to read about that incident of that woman that was found hanged in her apartment. And I feel like I could relate, and so many people I know, like, could definitely relate to her experiences. Like, after 5 years of struggling and organizing and seeing that nothing's changing and things are getting worse, and then hearing about all of the violations that are happening to other women in prisons, and feeling like you can't really do much about it. And specifically with how the media coverage has been, like the international media specifically, has been ignoring what's going on in the past couple of years.
So what is your plan now as somebody who has been part of this for the past 5 years, and of course before that too, being that you lived in Egypt?
I have continued from the very beginning of the uprising to try to offer the missing perspective and the missing stories and the stories that get lost in translation. It's very frustrating for me to be a witness to two different worlds that don't know anything about each other. And to see that the people who get portrayed in the Western media do not represent me and do not represent the people I work with and the people I associate with. So I always try to offer that perspective and find the opportunities, whether through writing or speaking or connecting people from Egypt and the US and other countries with each other and having people learn about what's going on through personal communication and experiences. So I'm here for a short amount of time, and I still don't know what's going to happen next. I had friends who were arrested upon returning home for speaking outside. So what I continue to do is trying to build these bridges and look at the other humane sides of the uprising and not just look at the politics involved or the political analysis or the government or elections or whatever. Like, look at these people who are part of the movement as individuals with feelings and experiences and traumas, and try to highlight that.
So finally, just a last question before you head out. What do you feel that activists in the U.S. if you could tell activists in the U.S. that are also fighting for freedom and justice, what would you tell them as a word of advice, considering that our military issue is much the same?
I think that there's so much education that needs to happen. People need to humble themselves and they need to open their minds and look at perspectives and analysis that might not be familiar to them. The U.S. continues to support the Egyptian state, and that goes back to a long time ago, since the 1970s with the Camp David Accord. And the U.S. looks at Egypt only as a strategic partner in the Middle East. And the military aid continues to flow regardless of the internal situation or the human rights situation or economical development or education or whatever. So people should be aware and they should learn more about the specifics of how that works. The continuous support from the U.S. administration, all the money that could go to support development here in the U.S. locally. I think that's important.
For more information on Salma and to read her first-hand accounts of life in Egypt then and now, check out her blog and quest for justice at inalllanguages.blogspot.com.